Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore, where high school students have grabbed international headlines over the past few weeks for, among other things, occupying City Hall. 3 were among 16 arrested, defending the right to protest and commit civil disobedience. This is going to be an especially critical issue here in Baltimore ahead of the trial of the 6 officers charged with killing Freddie Gray, a death that has sparked unrest and also the reimagining of what's possible here in the city. These same students with the group City Block have been on the forefront of demanding quality public education in Baltimore, a school system racked with many inequities. In January, high school senior Michaela Gilliam-Price spoke to TRNN's Megan Sherman after a die-in at education headquarters.
Kids don't have ownership of their education. They're not choosing what they want to learn. They're not learning anything that they need to know, which means that once they graduate, they're not ready to be active participants. They're ready to be scholars in an ivory tower in some white institution, and that's not what we need today. We need kids who are willing to be engaged in politics, who are willing to provide whatever they need for their people.
That's Michaela Gilliam-Price talking about the need for reform in education policies, student control over curriculum, and the end of the school-to-prison pipeline. Well, now joining us to discuss this are 2 guests. We have Ray Baker. He's the Director of Communications at AFT Maryland. We're also joined by Lois Weiner. She's a longtime teacher, veteran, professor of education, and the author of a number of books, including most recently, The Future of Our Schools. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Ray, talk about the student-led protests here, most recently at City Hall, but they've been marching, inspired by the events in Ferguson. They've been marching and demanding accountability and reform and demanding change.
I think what our students are doing in Baltimore City is awesome. For one, it speaks to their civic awareness, their desire to know what's going on in and around the community in which they live. And secondarily, and perhaps most important, it speaks to their decision to be controllers in their own community, to have an autonomy as to what's happening here. Now, we understand they're going up against the structures in place that have been in place for far a long time. And those young people, particularly as they transition on their way, because undoubtedly they're preparing themselves for college and going to move on and do other things, we hope that that plants the seeds in those young people to maintain the civic activism, both with the individuals that are there now and for those coming behind them. And I think that's a wonderful thing, and I think that's something that teachers are excited about, particularly when you have students being engaged in civic activity.
And Lois, your thoughts? So often we have young people, students, being on the forefront of these type of movements around the world and right here in Baltimore.
Absolutely. And the youth are reimagining society, and that's happening and fighting for it really fearlessly in a way that adults are frequently afraid to do. And I think that's a situation that we have. It looks to me like the situation that's in Baltimore is not so different from the situation that occurred in Philadelphia, where students in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Student Union, sat in the board headquarters in City Hall. The question is, what's going to be the role of adults here? And in particular, my interest is of teachers' unions. And I think the role of the teachers' union has to be to not only passively support these young people, but to use all of its resources to engage with the struggle and to help the struggle advance. In other words, the union has to be an ally. It can't be a passive supporter, it has to be an ally. It has to be meeting with young people, meeting with protesters, and using its resources to propel that movement for social justice forward. Now, I think the key to that, making that happen, is that you can't have a handful of leaders at the top who are saying, we are doing this on behalf of the union. We have to understand the union as being the members, but that means that the members have to discuss these issues. There should be meetings in every single school in Baltimore.
And Ray, the AFT of Maryland has helped hold such discussion. Can you talk about what the union has done?
So we've done several things, and I like Professor Weiner's point about the members, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the first things we did in the wake of the unrest after Freddie Gray's murder and after the events that took place immediately after, at the one high school, Douglas High School, which was nationally all over the news for some of the students engaging with law enforcement, our union had went and sat with the members there, just as you're alluding to. What is it that you all need? What is it that you all are hearing from your students? What do your students need? Because just as Professor Weiner alluded to, it's a symbiotic relationship where we're all intertwined and we're at our best when we've met the needs of one another. So teachers are meeting the students' needs, and the students are meeting the needs and coming back with the needs of the community. So we as the union wanted to hear from our teachers, what is it we can do to provide that support system? How can we take our orders, just as you alluded to, from our members in order to do that? And so that's one of the things that we've been doing.
And Ray, I wanted to get your response to one of the student leaders with City Block, the group that's been leading the protests at City Hall and that have led a number of protests over this past year. We spoke to Michaela Gilliam-Price. Who's one of the student leaders, and she said, so as of now, the union hasn't done too much explicitly to help us. There is a lot they can do. For example, City Block does not have an official teacher sponsor because they fear if we were to have student action during the school day, the teacher could come under fire or get fired. What's your response to that?
So I think the best way to handle whatever concerns Ms. Price has, as well as with the teachers at City Block, if I'm not mistaken, is from Baltimore. Is based out of Baltimore City High School, right? Baltimore City College High School, specifically. And so I think what's best is that the members there, the students there, coalesce and have a conversation as to how best that we can serve them. Once we have that conversation, our members at Baltimore City College High School will relay that back to the union, and our union will be frontline serving those students there. And in any way that we can be of assistance per our members' instructions, we will do that, and we're happy to do that. And we're waiting on the call, and we're eager to support, not just passively, as you said, but aggressively, the best desires, wills, and intention of our young people.
Lois, your thoughts?
I think the union has to be more proactive. I think that it's not enough for the union to have these meetings in a school after a crisis has occurred. We have to understand that there is a systemic problem in the school system, not just Baltimore, but throughout the country. This is a systemic problem, and it is not going to be either the union is going to address it when a fire occurs, and it's going to try to put out the fire by having the meeting there, or it's going to say we have to change totally the way we operate. And the way that we operate is that in each school we're going to have meetings between students and parents and teachers about what we need to do to alter the nature of education in this building and in Baltimore. And the union needs to be proactive in doing that. And
Lois, and so, I'm familiar with several teachers that work in Baltimore, and, Maryland is the wealthiest state in the country, but Baltimore City is among the most impoverished. And so what would you say to teachers whose parents are, locked up in the cycle of incarceration or have challenges or are not, in a lot of schools, you have the problem with parents not being able to be fully engaged and maybe working 3 minimum wage jobs just to be able to make ends meet?
Well, I think that we need to redefine engagement because people, the same thing is true for teachers. Not every teacher is going to be an activist. But I think that what we need to do is we need to have respectful alliances with parents, which means that we understand that there are parents who are going to contribute in one way and parents who are going to contribute in another way. And that's something that schools have a problem with. This is not just an issue for teachers and teachers' unions. And I'm going to put on my professor of education hat here. Schools and school systems have really been run on the basis of the deficit paradigm. If there's something wrong, if kids aren't achieving, then there's something wrong with the kids, or there's something wrong with the parents, or there's something wrong with the teachers. And we need to understand that there's something wrong with the system. And to me, what's wrong with the system is that we really don't trust the people who are in the schools and who are using the schools to be the people who are driving reform. So it's really a crisis of democracy.
One of the things that Professor Weiner alluded to in an earlier segment that we had with you, Jessel, was the idea of community schools. Now, community schools are being practiced all across the nation in various ways and forms. But here in Baltimore, one of the ways we're practicing community schools is the most literal definition by the word community, right? And so we have these wraparound services, not just where we come in and bandage a particular need, but we hear from the actual parents that are there, the students that are there. This democracy of education that Professor Weiner is talking about is taking place in Baltimore. Again, we're talking about Baltimore, Maryland, and the critiques that it sounds like the professor is making, and forgive me if I'm speaking out of turn, seems to be one of a national critique with Baltimore and Maryland included. But what we're we're seeing in Baltimore is specifically a democratization of education, where our community partners, the students themselves, their parents are all invested in what's happening here because the schools are now that hub. Whether we're talking about Moravia Park Elementary School serving as a recreation center for so many of that place in that community who don't have one, whether we're talking about Fort Worthington Elementary School serving as a library, whether we're talking about City Springs having Zumba classes to increase the health and wellness and urban gardening, we're finding our community schools in Baltimore meeting the needs of our communities where they are. And one of the things we're hoping to do is to expand this across the nation. Expand this across the state. We've seen that the mayor of Baltimore approved more than $4 million in out-of-school time and after-school activities, which is going directly to our community schools. There's even talk in this upcoming legislative session that we hope to have statewide funding and expansion of community schools, at the very least through a task force that will ultimately blossom into community schools across the state of Maryland, because this begins the road to the democratization of education, where our community, our students, and our teachers all have a say in the welfare and the education of our young people.
I want to jump in here and say something else about this issue of poverty, which we touched on in the other segment that we filmed. I think we have to say that community schools may be a better model for the way we want to organize education, and at the same time, we have to say that no matter how well we organize schools, we are not going to be able to get rid of poverty. Schools can't eliminate poverty. Schooling and a good education is not the one true path out of poverty that Arne Duncan and Obama have said they are. And this is what the challenge that I hold out to the union. I hold out to the unions. We have to stop supporting politicians, giving them union support and union money unless they are willing to commit themselves to create an economy where everybody has an opportunity to have a good job. Because ultimately, it's not going to be community school. All community schools can do is to help kids compete for the diminishing number of good jobs. We have to do something about the number of good jobs. And that means that teachers' unions and labor in general have to push on that. They can't be afraid to push on that, which I think they are.
And that is a systemic issue here in Baltimore and Maryland. The unemployment rate for African American people of some age groups is 3 times that of whites. And we've seen study after study that growing up in poverty in this city, education is not an escape. It's almost impossible to escape entrenched poverty here, and a big reason for that is the lack of jobs. And so Lois earlier had suggested demanding government program to create jobs if the private sector isn't doing it.
That's a space for conversation around jobs and policy that I'm not interested in getting into right now. But I don't necessarily discredit the merit or the value of what's being said in that space. What I would like to concentrate on is this idea of how do we respond to the politicians? How do we respond to the events that are happening in our schools? Baltimore Teachers Union recently had their Quest program, where we had a city councilman come and speak with our members. And our members were able to engage him and converse with him on various issues, on various topics. Whether or not that the union members agreed with everything that councilman had to say, whether or not the union liked it, did not like it, would support him moving forward, that's for the members to decide as we come together and coalesce as an organization. But I think it's very valuable to recognize that the union does have to not forfeit, but use its resource to put in front of its members those who we have elected and to help be held accountable. And I feel confident that the Baltimore Teachers Union and AFT Maryland does that for our members.
And the issue of accountability, some of the teachers I had spoken to ahead of this segment, they want to know how they can be more engaged with community, how they can be more engaged with students, and how to foster that sense of accountability within the union movement itself.
As always, we encourage that, we want that dialogue is necessary. One of the lifelines of the Baltimore Teachers Union, particularly with regards to teachers, are going to be our building representatives, right? Our building representatives are tasked oftentimes with having the relationship with their peers in the building to communicate all that our union is doing for them, all that our union can do for them, and all that we want to hear from them. So our building representatives are the lifeline. They go back and forth between the members in the classrooms, in these buildings, our teachers, and our paraprofessional staff as well, and back to the union hall, our field reps, and our leadership team. And we have that, we hear those communications, we have that communication. And so we respond to that. So the important thing to the folks that you've been speaking with, and I'm sure they already know this, and if not, let me explicitly tell them, the communication with their building reps is vital. The building reps are tasked with an important job of taking that information that they receive at their meetings, that they receive on a day-to-day basis from our correspondents, and spreading that word. Once they're in touch with their building reps, they're in touch with us, and we are responding to their needs.
I just think that that may be the structure in theory, but there's a climate of fear in schools because of standardized testing, and the way that teachers' pay is tied to standardized testing, a weakening of teachers' unions, a weakening of contract, attacks on tenure, attacks on seniority. Teachers, many teachers are afraid, and I will wager that there are schools in Baltimore that cannot find anybody to be a building rep, because that is the situation throughout this country. And I think that a structure can exist on paper, and then the reality is what's going on in the schools. And what's going on in schools is a teaching force that's demoralized, that is often frightened, and that often feels intimidated by an administration. And so the question is, for me, as an educator, is what do we need to do to help teachers to feel empowered? And I think democratizing the union and bringing the union's presence to the school site so that people understand the union as a vehicle for democratizing the schools and education is really essential. But that has to be done on a progressive program. We can't separate this issue of jobs and say that's not related to what we do here.
So
Both
Ray,
of those
I'll give
discussions have to be combined. They have to be combined, and that's a hard thing for the union to do, but it has to be done.
Ray, I'll give you the final response.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate what Professor Weiner is offering, and I think that we've done that. One of the things that we've largely been proud of with the Baltimore Teachers Union and AFT-Maryland is our partnerships with those same organizations that are calling for the jobs, that are demanding for jobs all across. And one of the things that I think that the professor is an expert in is what's happening nationally. And without a shadow of a doubt, everything she's saying is valuable. I think there may, in every situation, be exceptions to rules, and I'm pretty confident that our building reps all throughout Baltimore City are confident that they can speak with their union about everything. Our building reps and our teachers in the classroom have relationships with our field representatives and do a fantastic job of communicating their desires, their issues with our union so we can respond to their needs. Again, are we saying that our union is perfect? No one would say that. That'd be hypocritical and that'd just be flat out wrong. But we're saying that we're doing great things for our members, and our members know we're doing great things for them. We go to bat for them regularly. They're confident about that. And as long as we continue to progress with this relationship that we have with our members, this democratization of our union, the Baltimore Teachers Union, we hope that Baltimore and ultimately AFT-Maryland will progress to be an example for the rest of the nation. Lastly, on one piece for Professor Weiner on the testing piece. AFT-Maryland and MSEA have come together to push back on too much testing. There have been ads on airwaves. There have been town halls hosted by one of your colleagues, Jessel, Mark Steiner from WEAA 88.9 FM, Morgan State Radio, where we've said just that from teachers from the Baltimore Teachers Union. Teachers from MSEA are both saying we cannot do the job of teaching. They're saying this publicly and on the record. We cannot do the job of teaching if we have too much testing in our schools. So both of those unions are collaborating to make sure that we don't have too much testing, that our children aren't over-tested, and that we can get back to the business of educating the young people in Maryland.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for joining
you.
us.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.